So I was both. Lomas Chicos was the first, they had different cliques. And so they had the Pequeños, they had the Dukes, the Chicos, and then the Locos was supposed to be the hardcore guys. So I got jumped into the Chicos, and then eventually people say, hey dude, you gotta be a loco, you gotta, these are the guys that would do all the jobs. I'm talking about the robberies, the shootings, these are the hardcore guys. I got jumped into the locos.
We got Luis J. Rodriguez. Thank you for coming today, sir.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Man, your story is truly a vida loco, right?
That's why it's called on my book, Always Running La Vida Loca, Gang Days in LA. It was a crazy life.
Crazy life you lived, man, and you're a best-selling author. But what's interesting and what I learned about you, Luis, is that you're Tarahumara.
Tarahumara native out of Chihuahua, Mexico. Been there for tens of thousands of years, these people. They preceded all the Europeans, all the Spanish, and believe it or not, where the Chihuahuan Desert goes, where they're from, goes into Texas and New Mexico. So that border came in right in the middle of indigenous people's land.
And your father was really more native, but he liked to suppress that native aspect of his life, correct?
That was a big deal in Mexico. When you're in Mexico, you would putting down the native. The Spanish taught you a caste system. And the darker you were, if you were black, it's even worse. If you were part native or even more native, that's worse. If you had more Spanish, light skin, blue-eyed, you were up top. You know how that goes. So it was a racist caste system that got perpetrated with the colonization of Mexico. They found out that a lot of Mexicans actually have more indigenous than they thought. The DNA is exposing that there's more indigenous roots. And so many people in Mexico, but also here, have gone back to their, not just Aztec, because Aztec is one tribe, but all the tribes, there's so many of them. And now they're going back to where my family's from. Like you say, Chihuahua, Tarahumara, there's other tribes. You want to know where you're from. My dad's from Guerrero. There's Nahuatl speaking people there. You just begin to look at where you're from, Michoacan, Purépecha, there's Oaxaca, Zapoteco, Mixteco, wherever you're from, you want to know the indigenous people there.
So it was rare for a man from that part of Chihuahua, Juarez,
yeah, he was a very educated man. And this is hard because a lot of Mexicans are working class people, farmers, come out of the fields. He was educated. He was a very highly energized person. He was politically active, which got him into trouble. He tended to be more leftist at the time in Mexico. And as you know, the government was run by the PRI, which was an old-time party, 70 years it ran Mexico. And they had their politics and they controlled everything. And he was kind of going against them. So they ended up imprisoning him in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And when he got out, he decided, I'm leaving Mexico, I'm going to the United States, I'm tired of this stuff. And this is why I tell people, we were actually going from our land to our land because the Tarahumaras were a part of that world too. So even though there was a bridge, an international border, it only been there 106 years when I was born, when the Tarahumaras have been there for tens of thousands of years. So it's going from our land to our land.
And that's been an ongoing discussion. A lot of Southern California, even up to Northern Cal, has been part of Mexico.
Yeah, and what's even more important is that it's part of Native peoples. We have all these roots. California has more Native Americans than any other state, and they got terribly treated, genocidal, murders during the gold rush, killing off tribes and people. A lot of indigenous people had to stop being indigenous. They became Mexican because Mexicans, even though they were indigenous, were considered white. I don't know if you know, the U.S. designated Mexicans as white. And my birth certificate in Texas, I'm white. My mom was Tarahumara is white. My dad, who's got a little African, they're all white. Didn't matter. It was just the way that's why I know it's a made up thing. What they call you, the race, it's all made up. We were white, so a lot of indigenous people ended up having to change their name or get away from being indigenous, be Mexican, just so they wouldn't be hounded and hunted down.
When you touched down in LA, you touched down in Watts. And at the time was it primarily black and brown in Watts?
It was already black and brown. I lived in the mostly black community. Central Avenue, blacks on one side, mostly black, the other side mostly Mexican. I lived in the mostly black side. And it's true that there was Japanese Americans, there was Italians, there was other immigrants that lived there, but by the time we lived there, in 1956, when we got there to the 60s when I was there, it was mostly black and brown. That's mostly what we had.
And it was still a very tough part of town even back then. And give us the era, was it the 60s?
So I was there from 1956 to about 7 years old. I don't know what year that was, but it was poor. You know what it was is old redlining. Even though it was declared illegal, they still couldn't let Mexicans and blacks live all over. So they put you in certain neighborhoods. We could have lived in Maravilla. We could have lived in Watts. There's other neighborhoods we could live in. We couldn't live in other neighborhoods. So we ended up in Watts because that's where we were allowed to be.
So a lot of the ghettos and the projects today are the result of
restricted covenants, restricted housing. And this is why black and brown people in LA and other cities live together. You know, I've always lived in black and brown neighborhoods. When I was living in San Bernardino briefly as an adult, I was living in a black and brown neighborhood, the west side. If you go to Pacoima, which is in the valley, it was black and brown. In fact, in Pacoima, now it's mostly Mexican, Central American. It used to be mostly black in the 70s. So that's the restricted covenants forced black and brown people and other dark-skinned people to live together compared to you couldn't break into the white neighborhoods.
And you think there was it by society's design to create a rift, a wedge between black and brown?
I think the wedge was created when they started to come together in the 60s. When Martin Luther King was uniting with Native Americans, with Chicanos, with Puerto Ricans, with poor white people. I say Martin Luther King, there was a lot of other people. The civil rights was black people taking it on, but a lot of civil rights also included Mexicans. For example, some of the early desegregation struggles in the 30s and 40s were Mexicans trying to desegregate the schools, because even Mexicans couldn't segregate with white people. So even though they might have designated us as white on our birth certificate, if you were dark skinned, if you were brown skinned, like a lot of us, you were still discriminated.
You know, there's a lot of Latino people in Southern California, California in general, but it wasn't always like that. And a lot of the youngsters don't understand some of the racism that you experienced. Speak on that a little bit, Luis.
Well, for example, I moved from the Watts. I was in the Valley short time, but we moved to San Gabriel Valley. San Gabriel Valley had 100 Mexican migrant communities. They were migrants. They worked the orange groves, walnuts, cherries, whatever was being grown. By the time I moved there, the fields were all gone. So we were surrounded by white suburbs, well-off white suburbs, not poor whites. And with the Mexican migrants were the poorest neighborhoods in LA County, those migrant communities. And that included like El Monte Flores, that included like El Jardín, that included like Sangra and Lomas, that included all these neighborhoods. And my neighborhood, South San Gabriel, was just north of Montebello, had dirt roads, little shacks. It was little Mexico. Shacks like in other parts of Latin America. And we were going to the white schools, which meant we were being treated badly. There was a tracking system. The A students were the academic, mostly white. The D students were the industrial arts, you know, the wood shop, auto shop, print shop, whatever it was, mostly Mexican. And we were tracked that way. Even if you wanted to be better in school, they didn't allow you. They kept you in your own tracking.
And this is pre-gangbang era. The Pachuco era is kind of ending right now, right? And tell us what youth would do in terms of wear jackets and identify themselves. This is before the whole gang thing kicked off.
Yeah, before the Cholo big gang things, which got big in the 60s, we had like party clubs. I don't know how else to call them. It's just social clubs. I joined one called the Impersonations. We had one called Little Gents, the Southside Boys. Those are the ones that I was in. There was the Animal Tribe, which was very big in that part of the San Gabriel Valley. But Lomas and Sangra were the two main neighborhoods, barrios. They've been there since the 40s. And by then they were organizing as a gang, street gang. They didn't call it a gang, it was a barrio, but they were more hardcore and they were jumping in all the clubs. You couldn't be in a club. Say, hey man, you claim this. The animal tribe was kind of incorporated. They stayed animal tribe Lomas for a long time. Then eventually animal tribe went away. But they were Lomas animal tribe for the longest time. Because they were bigger.
They were the last holdout of those clubs.
Yeah, yeah.
Basically, animal tribe merged into what is now Lomas 13 and that whole thing. But you didn't Sangra say, hey, you have to be with us, Luis?
Well,
or
here's the deal. They were recruiting both sides. And I knew guys from Sangra. When I was a kid, we used to play on the streets together. We were friends. But once they went to San Gabriel High School, we went to Marquepo or Sure High School, Montebello, we were split. And now you have to decide. And what happened with me is that I was with all the Lomas guys, but I had friends that were Sangra guys, And then the thing was, we used to say South Sangra for South San Gabriel. So you can't do that. There's only one Sangra, San Gabriel. Sangra was a Chicanoized way of saying San Gabriel. So we had a choice, and we chose Lomas. Because Lomas was bigger, Lomas was there, and of course they came up to us, you join our gang or whatever. You had no choice. You either were in Lomas and Sangra, so I joined Lomas.
And that's how the big, long feud between Sangra and Lomas started, right?
Well, it got really bad by then. At first it was fighting, stabbings, it wasn't, people had guns, but that really wasn't what it was. But I remember when then they started shooting people. And I remember when, I think Lomas shot and killed a kid from Sangra. That was the beginning. And then now it's all shooting. Drive-bys, house killings. And we call them house killings because you were shooting people's houses. You would firebomb their homes, Molotov cocktails. You would just do this very destructive thing. So the war got bad, people were killing each other. By the time I was 18, I lost 25 friends, both in Lomas and then the friends I had in Sangra that I knew. We were enemies, but they were still people I knew. I've included them among those 25 people that passed.
Explain to us a little bit about the Pachucos, because you remember that era.
Yeah, because I knew the old guys, the guys were still around, and they were the heavily tattooed guys. I mean, Pachucos were, tattoos were sailors, army men, eventually bikers, but even the bikers weren't doing the tattoos Chicanos were doing. Chicanos created that black and gray realistic fine line style that now became popular. It's the most popular style in the world. At the time, it was just Chicanos. We were really, and it wasn't sloppy. I have one that's 55 years old. I started my first tattoo when I was 12. It was pretty good work. And so I saw these old Pachucos with tattoos, and that's when I first saw the face. This guy was heavily faced. It wasn't all the guys, it wasn't that popular, but eventually Sangra guys or Lomas guys would have, they would have the teardrop, and eventually maybe they might put Sangra, or they might, little by little, they're putting face tattoos. It got to be bigger and bigger in the prisons, and then coming out of the prisons, juvenile halls, you started seeing more guys. By the 80s, I think it became a bigger deal. Pretty soon they have tattoos on their heads and all kinds of tattoos. We weren't doing all that, but I knew guys that had them as a way that Chicanos would do these tattoos that eventually everybody started doing. The sad thing about when you're in these gangs is everybody learned to respect you. Even the cops, even though they hated you, even the teachers, girls looked at you differently. You had the Pendletons, the long, hard Pendletons. You had the khakis. They were all ironed and starched and nice. And we had Stacey Adams in those days, and we had the tattoos. Nobody had tattoos. We were the only ones.
Tell the youngsters what Stacey Adams are.
Well, they were actually nice shoes, but they were the Cholo preferred shoes at the time. Eventually it was Cortez's, other shoes, but the Stacey Adams were these nice shoes. And I'll tell you one thing about them, you could jump fences on them. You could fight with them. They weren't like the fancy shoes where you couldn't do anything. I remember Stacey Adams, they were so good, you could jump fences and you can fight and everything else, and they would still hang.
And how'd you keep those Stacey Adams pristine? They were always polished.
You had to, man. One thing about being a Cholo in those days, you had to be sharp. The Pachucos brought that. You had to wear the best clothes. You had to be sharp. They had to be ironed, starched. Even your T-shirts. We had the big long tees where Chicanos started that style. We even ironed our T-shirts. You know what I mean? People could see us that these guys are different. We had a certain walk. You had to walk a certain way. You had to be really cool. You had a certain way of talking. We had a different style. We had little hats we called tandos, just so people could see we were different,
And did you guys weren't sagging your pants. They were up to the waist, right?
Yeah, and then we would have really big, like size 50 pants, but we would have these belts that would keep them out and ballooned out. But that's the way it would go. So we were all skinny. I was skinny as all get out. You look at me now, so this guy was skinny, but I was skinny. And they would go really high. And that was the cool thing. Then you would have a chain, or you would have your bandana, whatever it was. You'd have a way of wearing them. Even your bandana had to be starched.
Creased up,
ironed.
yeah. Now, would the chain be like a wallet chain? Is that...
You know what? They used to sell them in the Army stores, the Navy Army stores, and we would find these old chains, and they just would sell these chains. And I think the Pachucos had them, and that's why everybody started selling them. And you could just put them up there. And then, of course, you had your knife, you had your weapons, you had whatever you needed to have, along with everything.
So the paneled in pants, dickies up high, creased. The
And we weren't boat heads at that time. We had these really nice, we used to call them copetes, with like an old pachuco, where your hair would stick up and then the ducktail at the end, So we had hair, but it was always in style. Or you would have a short hair, keep it short. We started doing the thing where you
like
would put
a flat top kind of?
Yeah, but you also a little flip, not quite flat top like the way the white kids, the surfer kids would have more something, but we would have a certain style with it where it was short, but it was always flipped over. We would use hair nets. That's how we started using hair nets. We said, why do you use hair nets? It kept our hair in a certain style. And then after a while, we started wearing hair nets like that's the way they did wear.
Right. And you'd see dudes wearing the hair nets.
Yeah.
And so that style eventually became Nike Cortezes. The Dickies stayed around, but they started to sag them a little bit, right?
The hip hop started to come on the West Coast.
Right.
It became more like a combination hip hop and cholo. And that's okay. That's how things change. They had the cut off pants, and they had the long, we call it socks all the way to the top. They had Cortezes, but they still had the same style. Everything ironed, everything very cool. Always make sure you walk a certain way,
But you were starting to see more sport gear introduced into the look, like Raiders caps. You guys weren't really rocking the fitted Raiders.
We weren't doing that, no. And then, of course, then the bald head guys, the pelones started happening. Everybody had bald heads, and then the tattoos started getting on the face, on their heads, how that goes. And now the gang's got all kinds of different guys. I mean, there's still a cholo style, but the cholo style is not even so much a gang thing anymore. Sometimes it's just a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Low riding cars. It's not about gangs. Their families have low riding cars. People can dress up like a cholo, but they're not gangsters. And so I think it's become a more cultural expression of the barrio streets. It's a Chicano, partly Chicano. Not all Chicanos do this, but it's a very Chicano thing that other cultures have taken up.
You say the word Chicano. Lately, there's been an ongoing debate. Can I be El Salvadorian and claim Chicano? Can I be Honduran? Is that term only reserved for Southern California Mexicans?
Well, it was only because Mexicans were the majority here. And in the 80s, you had refugees from the civil wars, right? El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, that came to the Mexican neighborhoods. So they adopted Chicano style. Everybody did. I even saw, of course, Cambodian kids pick up Chicano style. The black Bloods and Crips were Chicanoized African Americans. You know what I'm saying? A lot of when you see Snoop Dogg and they were Chicanoized black. So Chicanos influenced everybody, and so Salvadorians and others became very Chicanoized.
And are you cool with that as a Chicano?
Yeah, because I think it's just the way there are people. They live in the same neighborhoods. Now, all Mexican neighborhoods have Central Americans, so they're part of our community. There's intermarriages between them. And even though El Salvador and Guatemala, they have different Spanish, they have different cultural expressions, it's very different. On the other hand, we kind of came together in these streets, and even the gangs started recruiting Salvadorians and Guatemalans, Hondurans. They didn't even care. I would go to communities when I came back from Chicago, and I would come and talk to kids in high schools. They all looked Chicano to me, but I would ask them, where's your family from? Oh, I'm from Honduras, from Guatemala. So in other words, you have to ask them because they all look and talk Chicano until you actually find out where they're from.
But I'm glad that you have embraced the Chicano culture. It's very cool to see someone from the other side of the ocean love the culture, and it seems like you really take pride in representing kind of the culture.
Yeah.
Do you feel like a guest in the culture? Like,
Yeah, kind of,
Yeah.
but I still like I feel like same way. Like I mean, like they accept me. So now I respect, I show love to the Chicano people.
Right.
Yeah, that's like I feel now.
Japan has a Chicano Cholo culture, very big, low riding. They appreciate it. I don't consider it appropriation as much as they appreciate some of the Japanese picked up this culture. In other words, this interaction of cultures is true for everybody. Like a lot of Chicanos picked up African American styles. The Pachuco really, the Zoot suit came from Harlem. They stylized it even more, but the point is urban culture started interacting.
So, Louis, we've had a lot of different walks of life on the show, some of which have been from La Cosa Nostra, some old mob guys. And back in the day, there was a word called omerta, the code of silence, the G code. What did the Latinos, the Cholos call that? What was that term called?
Well, the biggest term that we use was palabra, which means word. And what word means is you got to be your word. And the thing is trust. If you're in a gang, you really want to trust people, which is why you don't really recruit all kinds of people. Now people recruit all kinds of people. Like, look at, you only recruited the ones you trusted, the ones that you could show that they could do it, that they weren't scared, that they could stand up, the ones that went to juvenile hall, the ones that went through the prisons, the camps, even prison system, because it teaches you that these guys are going to be there for you. So trust, which in Spanish means is confianza, but we use the word palabra. Word. Be your word. That was more important than that you shot people, more important than if you had tattoos everywhere. Those guys don't impress nobody, even if you've been shot. I've seen guys who were shot all kinds of times. None of it impresses anybody except, are you palabra?
Right. And based on what you're seeing out here in the streets, do you think palabra is in play right now or no?
I think anybody would tell you, and I'm not the only one, that it's gone down a lot. You don't really trust anymore. I know that, especially when I go into prisons now, people tell me, hey man, I remember the old days, nowadays we can't trust. Young people tell me I can't trust nobody anymore. Heroin, all the drugs ruins the trust, because pretty soon a heroin addict is only thinking about his fix, and he would do whatever he can sometimes. They started becoming informants. Who would inform on the police? A heroin addict could be one of these informants because he wants that fix.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that heroin is a big part of your story. You got addicted to heroin, and you started using what at age 12 or something crazy?
I started doing heroin at 12. I started with weed and sniffing, huffing, what people call. But we started doing it by putting heroin on our weed sticks or
what'd you guys call those, Castro sticks?
Or super cools, all kinds of
Super
things.
cools.
You would call them all kinds of things. And then what we would do is then also start snorting it, which gives you a bigger high. And then pretty soon you realize it's not enough. You would skin pop it in muscles, In other words, and then eventually you start realizing, man, I got to use it intravenously, because that's when you get the high goes right to you quicker, faster. Then you start doing that, and then you're injecting it. So I was doing it from 12 to about 15, all kinds of ways with other drugs. I did PCP, I did pills, I did LSD, whatever was going on. But then I started injecting it at 15, and then that became the overriding thing. Pretty soon it's all about my next fix. Well, who do you got to steal? I learned to mug people. I had a 25 caliber gun that I would use just to mug people. I found out the gun didn't even work. Some homie gave it to me, and then one day I tried to shoot it. It didn't even work. It didn't matter. I mugged all kinds of people with it just to get money. You steal, you rob your own family. That's the sad thing about it. Eventually, all that trust, all that palabra goes away when you start getting into the drugs.
Right. And in the first chapter of your book, you reference an old Mexican saying. You say, for those without tears, have a grief which never ends. Do you think that's why you did heroin, is because you could never cry this shit out, all this pain?
I call it the pain of death in life. I mean, the peace of death in life. What you wanted was to be numb. All the pain, and includes emotional pain. It's probably more emotional pain. When I grew up in a neighborhood, and even in my household, where men weren't supposed to cry. When I was 10 years old, my mom used to hit me, with everything, the hose, the clothesline, the clothes, the hangers, with the chancla, and then eventually I wouldn't cry at 10 years old. And I got her pissed off, but she got me that way. She told me, cry, only babies cry, you're not a baby. So I wouldn't cry. She stopped hitting me because it wouldn't matter. you learn to not be human. You learn to stop feeling. I'll tell you another story. I used to be in my imagination a lot. I loved being in my imagination. I didn't really like playing in the street like my other friends and my brother, but I wanted to be in my own little imagination, play with trucks and my army men. But people force you in the street. And one day I was playing dolls with my sisters, which is no big deal. Dolls. And then I was in, my neighbor, 9 years old, my neighbor next door had dolls and she invited me over. I started playing dolls. Well, two of my little homies, 9, 10 years old, walking by, they saw. They were all young. The next day, I got hell in school. People called me all kinds of names, including faggot, all kinds of names I didn't understand when they were playing with dolls. And then they jumped me. I got 9 years old. That's how I became a chin. They actually cracked my jaw when they beat me up and I was on the ground. And I promised myself on the ground, beaten down, I would never again be on the ground ever. And that's when I decided I'm going to be a cholo. I'm going to be a gangster. At 2 years later, 11 years old, I started my first little cholo club, social club that eventually became Lomas. I was never going to be beaten down by anybody. And I stopped crying. I stopped playing with my imagination, playing with dolls or anything, whatever it was. I don't mind talking about that because the sad thing about it is most of us men are sensitive too. But we weren't allowed to be that way. And you couldn't cry in juvenile hall, you couldn't cry in prison. If you cried, you had to do it on your own. You couldn't be there with others. And so you had to learn to stop being fully human.
So when you bury that pain so deep inside, heroin, cholo, gangbang, and it's a natural progression, right?
Yeah, because pretty soon heroin numbs everything. You don't care about nothing.
The U.S. military left a lot of poppy fields down in Mexico, right?
So they had these poppy fields for the morphine. All these soldiers, World War II. And then when the war ends, they just abandoned these poppy fields. Most Mexican drug guys' families, they weren't really cartels at the time, they were just families, were into marijuana. That was the big deal. Eventually they took over these poppy fields. That's how heroin became a big business in Mexico. The poppy fields were becoming useful. Heroin, they synthesized them. Pretty soon you can get it all over. And after World War II, heroin started going to the ghettos and barrios all over the U.S., the poor people, poor white people. The greasers you're talking about, some of them were just poor white people, maybe Italians, maybe Jewish immigrants, whoever they were, but they were greasers, they were put down. All of our heroin started hitting all the poor neighborhoods, particularly the black and brown ones, and that's how we became addicts, that's how we became tecatos.
And you mentioned that sometimes heroin, the pull, the addiction was so strong it would actually piece up rivals. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Well, here's the thing, you're fighting different barrios. This neighborhood killed my homie, killed my friend, maybe a family member. But when it comes to heroin, you didn't care about that no more. You got heroin, man. I know you're my enemy, but guess what? Let's shoot up. Like that becomes the fellowship now. It's not about the body anymore. In fact, I'm convinced heroin stopped a lot of worse body warfare. It was pretty bad, but it would have been worse if it wasn't for heavy drugs like that. Because pretty soon you didn't care about fighting as much as you cared about the next hit. And if it was an enemy and he's got the chiva, as we call it, he's got the carga, he's got the, man, come on, homie. And don't tell nobody, but here we are shooting up,
When crack hit the scene, tell me what happened to the barrio and everything and how that changed the whole dynamic of
Well, here's another thing connected to the U.S., and I know this for a fact. The U.S. helped bring crack into the country. They did it because they tried to stop communism in Central America. And one of the ways they tried to do it is to support the Contras, which were counter-revolutionaries against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And one of the ways they would do that, because the Congress had stopped them from being able to use U.S. funds, is they would use people to sell drugs here to help fund this stuff. What happened, though, is cocaine was very expensive. You couldn't really, poor people weren't doing cocaine. Heavy money people could do it. But they figured out a way to make rock, They figured out a way to make crack, where you can get the same cocaine, condense it in such a way that it could be used and be made in anybody's, kitchen. Now it's available everywhere. And then you had the crack houses, and people could all shoot up, go smoke it together, you know, and pretty soon it became a cultural thing. This undermined everybody's ability to survive. Crack epidemic destroyed whole cultures, whole people, even people with money, you know, famous people, even revolutionaries, Black Panthers, Brown Berets, some of them were heavy duty, and then they all got into crack. So crack became another way that they destroyed the cohesiveness of either the culture or even politics.
Wow, that is just heavy. And we all, you know, a lot of people who've studied history know about the Iran-Contra scandal, where it was like a little triangle where coke was being sent out here, guns down there, and it was just all evil. There wasn't anything good about it.
And I'll tell you something, I was a consultant, a script consultant for Snowfall, the TV show that John
Singleton,
Rest who was
in
a really
peace.
great guy. He passed. He was a really good friend. He helped me get in there. And I was in there because I was trying to get these people to understand that the CIA part, they had three parts, CIA, the Mexican, and the Black part. But the CIA part, they made them like rogue agents. And I was telling them they weren't rogue agents. They were good Americans. They were good Christians with suit and ties making these decisions. These decisions were being made dispassionately. You know what I'm saying? By people who could make these decisions. And good Marines like Oliver North, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't these rogue crazy guys, it was these regular people. And people don't know that. And they think, well, okay, what happened? Well, they allowed it to happen. And the cartels now became, out of Colombia, now they made cartels out of Mexico. They weren't really cartels until then. Now they're big cartels. So we have a role in our country, unfortunately, either with heroin or with crack and other things, to be held accountable for. Our country played a role in these things.
I know you don't like the term, but you are an OG. You know, you've been around the horn, man. You've been through every imaginable experience, from gunplay to heroin use to gangbanging to dysfunctional families. But the one thing you've reconnected with along your hero's journey, if you will, is your cultura and your love for your culture. You love it so much, you started Tia Chucha's, which is a cultural center to educate our youth. Can you speak more about this center in Sylmar?
Yeah, so it started 21 years ago, me and my wife and my brother-in-law, and we thought of the idea of, we're in these barrios that had no bookstores, no art galleries, no cultural spaces, a lot of liquor stores, you know, a lot of other things. You can buy guns, you can buy drugs there, but you can't buy a book. So we decided, let's create a space with culture, art, music, dance, theater, everything. So it had 5 parts to it. It had originally a coffee bar with our own roast, Tia Chucha Mexican, Oaxacan Mexican coffee. And then we had art gallery, and we had a performance space. And then we had the bookstore, and we had workshops in all the arts. So we did that. We had to be pushed out because you know how landlords are. We're in these strip malls and they want to hire the rents. We've been in 4 different strip malls. Now we're in this one place where we're going to be there for a while. It's the last one. We've been there about a year already. It's beautifully done in indigenous Mexica Mayan motifs, beautiful art on all the walls, books right away. As soon as you walk in, you see books. Little kids love it, because it's children's books, bilingual books, culture books, social justice books, art, literature, poetry, it's all kinds of stuff. And then of course we have the performance space, and we have workshop centers where people can learn the Aztec dance, all the way to art, the music, guitar, son jarocho, tradition from Veracruz, all these beautiful stuff. And then we have a little art gallery, the only one in the whole area. It's very popular. We've gotten a lot of funding now. It's a nonprofit. It started off as an LLC, but now it's nonprofit. My wife used to run everything for 17 years. She did it without pay. Now people say, oh, it's slave labor. No, it's a love of this community. I couldn't afford to feed my family, and I wasn't going to. I made enough money with my writing, my books. I have 16 books. I could do that, so she could do it, and she did it. And now we've turned everything over to these young people. There's about 15 people that work there now. All these young people, we've hired all these people, Mexican, Central American, young people, beautiful, and they made it even better. So it's in their hands. Me and my wife don't do the day-by-day, even though we're still there. We're guides, we're elders, my wife's on the board, we're still active. But it's in their hands. And it's raised a lot of money. I do more than $1 million a year with everything we do. And it all goes back. It's not profits. Nobody's
This is
profiting.
a 501c3, guys. So
501c3, yeah.
if you want to donate, please donate to Tia Chucha's. And I want to shoot out a couple people outside the Cultura, Bruce Springsteen and John Desmore from the Doors for
They've
shooting.
supported us.
For shooting.
I mean,
some
why would
support.
Bruce Springsteen out of New Jersey? But you know what? He's a loving guy. He cares about community. He makes big money, and he's done this where he's given money to community groups, and he supported us. John Desmore, the Doors used to be one of my favorite bands when I was in the '60s and everything. Now he's one of our friends. Cheech Marin has helped us. We have a lot of other support coming. Danny Trejo has been through there. He's helped spread the word. So we have good support from that end, as well as community, which is the most important support. That community comes in. They put in their $5, $2 to help make us happen.
You live now in the San Fernando Valley, and you've had the privilege of going all over the world to the UK and so forth as a best-selling author. And you've been through Texas, you've been through Chicago, you've been through California. Settle a big debate with us as to which has the best Mexican food.
Well, obviously Mexico has the best Mexican food. But there's so many Mexicans here now. And Chicago people don't realize a lot of Mexicans. It may be cold in Chicago, but they work. They came in to work in the steel mills, the stockyards. When they all went down, they stayed and worked. So wherever Mexicans go, there's Mexican food, and it's good. And you go to New York City, go to the taco trucks. They're great. I was in Manhattan, had me a beautiful taco in a taco truck. So I think wherever Mexicans are is where Mexican food is, and that's usually the best.
What's your favorite spot out here?
Well, you know what? I got a lot of them. And I have to say, I don't want to push somebody that I don't know. They just opened up a place called Los Tóxicos. That means the toxics. Mariscos, which is seafood. Los Tóxicos Mariscos. That's a terrible name, but I'm going to tell you.
Horrible
great
name.
Food. The food is amazing. Baja California seafood. I love it. I know I'm pushing them, but the point idea is they do good food. They're right there in Silmar, 2-minute walk from my house, and you know what? It's good, and I support anybody that does good food the way they do it. The name is kind of weird, but the food is great.
One last question before we part ways, Luis. Is there room in your life to mentor a really good author, a young Chicano kid, or any kid that wants to break into the game?
I do this all the time. I love mentoring people, and I believe in mentoring. Let's just say that we all should really work on mentoring young people. A lot of these kids that are in trouble wouldn't be in trouble if there was at least one mentor for every young person in trouble. So I really believe in that. I do my best to mentor as many young people as I can.
That's beautiful. How can our audience tap in with you? Are you on Facebook and stuff? Or
yeah, so I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. Try to look up my name, different names are there. But I'm also got my own website, luisjrodriguez.com. You can find my handles there too as well.
We'll throw that up in the link. Mr. Rodriguez, thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you, man. It was great. My honor.